Welcome to today's event. We are just going to wait about a minute to let everyone continue filtering in. We see that there has been a wait in the wait room.
Oh.
Again, thank you for attending. As more people are continuing to filter in, we will just wait about 30 more seconds. All right, let's get started.
All right, well, thank you all for joining us for the Pacific Council's webcast on information at war. My name is Madison McAleese. I'm an associate consultant at La Piana Consulting, a national nonprofit consulting firm, and a former staff member at the Pacific Council. And I will be moderating this event. We are super delighted to welcome Professor Philip Seib, Professor Emeritus of Journalism and Public Diplomacy at the University of Southern California. I am personally thrilled to be moderating this event with my favorite professor from grad school. Professor Seib is a prolific writer and expert on journalism, information, disinformation, and modern warfare. His new book, Information at War, is an excellent work dedicated to exploring the role of information in warfare throughout history and today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to speak with us on this topic, Professor Seib. I will now turn it over to you for some opening remarks for a few minutes before we hop into some questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Madison. That's a very nice introduction. I think I'll retroactively raise your grade to an A+ for that. So it's great to be with you. I've been writing about media and armed conflict for a long time now, covering any number of wars, and especially about the ways in which the dissemination and effects of information can be a secondary influence in armed conflict. But now information is plentiful and accessible at an unprecedented level and has become a primary factor itself in warfare. And we'll see plenty of examples of that as we go through the afternoon. In the context of warfare, why is this important? Well, particularly from the standpoint of democracies, there's public opinion is important, and that can become a vulnerability. Public opinion is usually pliable. And this is not a new thing. I mean, you can go back to Athens versus Sparta and find examples of disinformation and manipulative information being used. A little more recently, there are good cases involving the United States in 1940, when the British government, Winston Churchill in particular, was very eager to have information, sympathetic information, broadcast to the United States from Britain during the Blitz. And he arranged for Edward R. Murrow to make his famous broadcast live during the bombing of London. Also at that time, the British set up a so-called news organization in New York City to deliver to the American public information in the form of news stories that was very favorable toward the United Kingdom. Remember, this is a time when there was a strong isolationist trend in the United States. And while the Brits and the Americans were doing this, the Germans were also sending information into the United States. They didn't really expect or want the United States to come in on their side. They wanted the United States to remain neutral. So the German information was pushing in that way. And public opinion, all the parties involved recognized that public opinion could be manipulated. Now, that has changed during the course of the 20th century and into the 21st century. If you think about the information universe as it was at the beginning of the 20th century, around the time of the Spanish-American War, you're still reliant exclusively, really, on print. And then in the 1920s, radio begins its rise in the United States. And then in the 1950s and into the 1960s, television. And then after that, we have satellite and global television. And then finally, we have the internet and all that comes with that. So what we've had is a population explosion of sorts in the information universe. There's so many providers and they're so easily accessed. So what do we do with all this information? How do we determine importance and accuracy? Well, we once had gatekeepers. When I was growing up, every evening my family tuned in to Walter Cronkite on CBS, who told us, and that's the way it is. And it was a fairly centrist kind of broadcast, and we had a choice between Cronkite and on CBS and NBC, and then in the mid-60s, ABC came into play as well. There was a gravitational pull there towards a center, fairly moderate outlook on the world, and there weren't many alternatives for us. There was no national newspaper at that time. There was national radio, but for the most part, the three networks and their news anchors had a disproportionate amount of authority in terms of shaping our outlook toward the world. They were the gatekeepers. If you had a story, it had to go through them to get to us. Well, of course, now that is pretty much obsolete. The demise of the gatekeeper is best illustrated by Donald Trump's very clever use of Twitter. Why go through the news media and when you could go directly to the public with Twitter? So he was really a master of this during his presidency and his campaign for the presidency. And I think we'll see more and more, we have seen more and more political figures going straight to the public without any filter by any sort of news organization. Everyone can have a voice, interesting or outrageous, accurate or inaccurate. They can find an audience. Now, Henry Kissinger observed about 20 years ago that there is a gap between information and knowledge and a gap between knowledge and wisdom. And in those gaps is where the dangers are. So this is not an esoteric issue. It involves national security. Excuse me. Suppose a government wants to significantly damage an adversary nation without engaging in traditional warfare, bombs and bullets. Your goal is not necessarily to seize territory, but to destabilize the adversary's political system, making the nation less of a competitive threat to you, or a softening up before you do engage in kinetic warfare. The most visible practitioner of this is Russia. And we'll talk a little later about Ukraine in particular and Russia, but I want to read you a brief excerpt from the book, Information at War. This is from an article written by General Valery Gerasimov, who is the chief of the general staff of the Russian armed forces. He wrote, "The very rules of war have changed. The role of non-military means of achieving political and strategic goals has grown, and in many cases, they have exceeded the power of force of weapons in their effectiveness. These non-military means," he added, "should be, quote, applied in coordination with the protest potential of the population, which could presumably be heightened through the use of informational measures." Later in this same article, Gerasimov noted that the information space opens wide asymmetrical possibilities for reducing the fighting potential of the enemy. Well, that point about protest potential, is something that we're going to see as we continue our discussion being a big factor, whether it's in Ukraine, the Baltics, or elsewhere. Another Russian general, Andrei Kartapolov, wrote in 2015 that a classical war of the 20th century consisted usually of 80% violence and 20% propaganda. New type wars consist of 80 to 90% propaganda and 10 to 20% violence. So there is this restructuring of military priorities to use information not as sort of a sidebar to the overall military effort, but to make it more of a principal force. In fact, Russia has its own information corps within its military. Now, one of the tools that Russia has used is something called the Internet Research Agency, which is based in St. Petersburg, Russia, and run by one of Vladimir Putin's friends that presumably and almost certainly works at the behest of the Kremlin. To give you an example of what an agency, what an operation like this can do, here's a case from 2014 when the Internet Research Agency targeted the United States. Let me just read this bit to you. One was an effort to spread news about a chemical plant explosion in Louisiana. Another reported an Ebola outbreak in Atlanta. And one more claimed that an unarmed Black woman had been shot by police, also in Atlanta. The online content was polished using logos from CNN and other news outlets. The report about the chemical plant included eyewitness accounts. The Ebola story featured video of medical workers in hazmat suits. The Atlanta shooting story offered fuzzy video of the incident. All this was enough to cause brief panic and force first responder agencies to investigate and comment. None of those things ever happened. They were all invented, and not just invented, but produced like a television show by the Internet Research Agency. Now you can imagine this was really apparently just a trial run to see what they could do. And there was no chemical plant explosion, there was no shooting, there was no Ebola in Atlanta, but it remains a continuing problem. David Sanger of the New York Times wrote this about the Internet Research Agency, that it marked a moment of profound transition in how the internet could be put to use. For a decade, it was regarded as a great force for democracy, as people of different cultures communicated. The best ideas would rise to the top and autocrats would be undercut. The IRA, the Internet Research Agency, was based on the opposite thought. Social media could just as easily incite disagreements, phrase social bonds, and drive people apart. So we see that with what the Russian efforts have produced a significant array of players, the Internet Research Agency being one of them, in what they call active measures that can undermine the political systems of adversary countries. And if you're interested in more details about the IRA, the Mueller report, which includes the text of the indictments of various Russians, is very much worth reading. I'm going to skip over China for now because we're going to get to that a little bit later. But whether it's Russia or China or Yemen, the Houthis in Yemen, for example, or just about any other player in some kind of political or military conflict, the goal is to control the narrative, local, regional, and global. And that's what we see a lot of this going on. Controlling the narrative means having the dominant messaging that most people are going to believe. Now, how do you respond to this? Well, in 2018, in November 2018, at the time of the US congressional elections, the US Cyber Command launched an electronic attack on the Internet Research Agency. There was concern that the Internet Research Agency was going to try to meddle with the congressional elections on that date in in November 2018. And so the United States military, and there is a very sophisticated cyber command run out of the Pentagon, launched this attack and knocked the IRA off the internet for 3 days. It was a balanced retaliation. It was not escalation. And what did the Russians do in response? Nothing. They knew what was going on. They knew they didn't want to escalate either. All of these countries are just sort of feeling their way along now. And in the book, I get into examples such as the Israeli Defense Forces versus Hamas and other cases like that. And it's a developing science, really, how all this is being done. The big question in all this, of course, is when does information use reach the level of an act of war? Could you say that phony information about Atlanta and that I gave from 2014, was that an act of war? Was the US knocking out the Internet Research Agency an act of war? That is very ill-defined at the moment, although NATO is edging closer to considering hybrid acts, which is a combination of information and cyber warfare, as requiring an Article 5 response. And when we talk about the Baltic states, we'll get more into that. The best way to probably deal with this flood of information and making sense of it all is by enhancing media literacy. And we will, I know Madison has questions about that as well. So Madison, why don't we just go ahead and you get started, and we'll pick up questions then from the audience, but you go ahead and get us started, please.
Sounds good. Thanks, Professor Seib. So I'll hop into a Q&A and then open the floor for additional questions from participants. Just a reminder, you can use the button at the bottom of your screen and click the Q&A button, and that's where you can enter your questions. So Professor Seib, you just talked a little bit about this, and I know it's top of mind for a lot of us. Given the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and Russian aggression, the Biden administration recently approved $200 million in defensive security aid for Ukraine. And just yesterday, in his news conference, said that Russia will likely move in on Ukraine. So while military aid is important, you do describe the situation in your book as both a battle of words and a battle of bullets. So you mentioned this a little bit, and I'm just curious, at what point do you think that these information attacks should constitute our acts of war, and how do we respond?
Well, it's very interesting that we're talking about Ukraine today, because within the past few hours, the US State Department has put out 3 substantial documents about Russia's top 5 persistent disinformation narratives regarding Ukraine, taking action to expose and disrupt Russia's destabilization campaign in Ukraine, fact versus fiction, Russian disinformation on Ukraine. And obviously, this is part of the defensive strategy that the United States is trying to develop to help undermine any sort of Russian information that is untrue, and also knowing that the Russians have been sending that kind of information into Ukraine. These documents, by the way, are publicly available on the State Department website. So, what's going to happen in Ukraine is anybody's guess, and it's probably largely going to be determined by Vladimir Putin's whim. But we can see there, it's kind of a model, unfortunately, for what might happen in other countries. Ukraine has a significant, certainly not a majority, but a significant minority population that it has Russian ethnic ties and is Russian speaking in the east of the country. That population is being and has been barraged with information coming from Russia, saying that the government of Ukraine, the legitimate government of Ukraine that the United States and other countries recognize, is in league with the United States and NATO, and the common word that is being used to describe the West is fascist. And so this flood of information into Ukraine has been used to stir up the eastern part of the country And presumably, if Russian forces, regular Russian armed forces, move into Ukraine, they will be counting on support from Ukrainian citizens in that part of the country. This is a heck of a mess. I mean, it's going to involve, if the Russians proceed, it is going to involve a lot of bloodshed. It's going to put tremendous pressure on the Western countries, on NATO countries, even though Ukraine is not a member of NATO. But it's kind of interesting from my standpoint, looking at information at war, seeing how heavily first the Russians and now the United States are relying on disseminating information and rebutting the other's information.
You also write about Russia's additional targets, in particular the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And like you said, while in a more secure position as members of NATO, they also do have robust campaigns to counter Russia's information war. Estonia in particular has a long and impressive history of focusing on digital diplomacy and cybersecurity. So are there lessons to be learned here?
Well, I think the main lesson is that information warfare has to be taken very seriously, because it can, in combination with digital warfare or cyber warfare that can wreck a country's infrastructure, or at least temporarily severely damage it, it can have crippling effect. Now, I think one of the Russian strategies is probably to see how the NATO countries react if there is an invasion of Ukraine, and from that, Putin can gauge just how far he might want to go to attacking or trying to undermine the Baltic states. Now, Putin has made it pretty clear that he very much favors a reconstitution of the old Soviet sphere of influence. And I think, frankly, in addition to the Baltic states, another target that we will see come into play very soon is Finland, which of course borders Russia, fought a war with Russia back in the late 1930s and acquitted itself quite well. And it's not a member of NATO. So it's kind of a tempting target. It has flirted with NATO, it cooperates with NATO, but it's not a member, so it's not protected by the NATO charter. And I'm not sure why Putin is doing all this, except to again, he's got this basic feeling that it's time to reassert Russian, sort of as the child of the Soviet Union, authority, and to keep prospective enemies at bay. Now, one thing you might remember from our class, that I always start out early in the course to bring home to people how Russia looks at things. I put two numbers up on the whiteboard. The first is 400,000, which is the number of Americans who were killed in World War II. 99+% of whom were members of the armed forces. Then I put up another number, 27 million. That's the number of Soviet citizens, 50% of whom were civilians who were killed in World War II. So when Putin domestically says, I am protecting us against anything like that ever happening again, he has some political coinage he can use. And that has to be taken into calculation as well. Back when the Soviet Union was falling and Germany was being reunited, there was a discussion about what Germany was going to do vis-a-vis NATO. If it was reunited, to what extent would it be involved in NATO, and would NATO troops go into what had been East Germany? Well, there's debate still about this regarding the notion that then Secretary of State James Baker told Mikhail Gorbachev, NATO will not move 1 inch to the east. Well, later discussion and analysis of that shows that he was talking about NATO troops not moving into East Germany, but the Russian interpretation of that is different. So there are many flashpoints out there. And if Russia moves into into Ukraine, how the United States and its NATO allies manage information to rally support within Western Europe, and also to calm any fears in the Baltic. See, this is all going to be done with information before the troops start moving. It's going to be very important to watch that.
I want to shift a little bit to talk about media literacy. And you just mentioned Finland. And as a response to Russian disinformation, you write about how Finland has adopted a really robust media literacy approach, where I thought this was amazing. In secondary schools, media literacy is a core part of the curriculum. Why don't you think we've seen the same appetite, or why do you think we haven't seen the same appetite for this in the US? And is this another tool in fighting Russian disinformation?
Well, it's a tool in fighting all kinds of disinformation, domestic as well as foreign. And I think it's inexcusable that the United States has not paid more attention to media literacy. Media literacy basically means sort of reinforcing skepticism. When you see information, whether it's on a network television newscast or it's a tweet from somebody you don't know, your initial reaction should not be, well, it's a news organization, or, well, it's on the internet, so it all must be true. You should be skeptical. You should know how to check it out, to look for corroboration or for challenges to that kind of information. One of the senior officials in the Finnish government has said, our first line of defense is the kindergarten classroom, because they start not in secondary school, but in elementary school, all the way 1 through 12, and even including kindergarten. They incorporate media literacy, as you said, in the curriculum. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Another thing that could be done related to media literacy is news organizations all over the world should have reporters, should have journalists who are on the information beat. Just like there's a sports beat and a medical beat and a politics beat, there should be an information beat. It's too important, and information is too pervasive now to let it just be out there. There should be more and more examination of what's going on, more and more truth testing, but the responsibility for that should not rest with governments. It has to rest with individuals. And what we're looking at now is a sort of a generation down the road where this information, this media literacy training should begin now, so it carries forward forever. I mean, it has to be part of our system. As long as we have something like the internet, which deluges us with so much information, we need to know how to responsibly deal with that information. And that's what media literacy is all about.
We all know about, Russia's use of disinformation during the 2016 campaign, but some people may be surprised to hear how recently Russia has been spreading disinformation online throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. You mentioned it in your book, and I wonder how we could maybe even use media literacy to respond to that.
Well, you can see how this sort of fits in with Russia's general strategy of kind of, I guess we could call it intellectual destabilization, where they put out all this false information. And it's not just the Russians. There's all sorts of bad information about COVID vaccinations, about where COVID came from, and so on and so forth. And so if I'm an information consumer, if I'm somebody who looks at the internet, who looks at network television news, I masochistically switch back and forth between MSNBC and Fox News, and it just garbles my brain. I have to figure out what to do about that. And it's not just an esoteric matter or involving a foreign war that I don't really know much about or care much about. It involves me and my family in terms of how do I keep them safe? So the stakes are enormously high. And this is, again, an example of how the information universe is so overpopulated. And you see the stories going back and forth, whether it's Dr. Fauci versus so-and-so, and Governor so-and-so says we shouldn't mandate masks, and another governor says, yes, we should. It's a responsibility of the individual citizen to start to study all of that and try to work their way through the information and come up with what they believe. If they decide that it's not necessary to wear a mask, but they decide that based on their own detailed, careful examination of the information, so be it. But they shouldn't be misled by false information. What do you do about false information? How do you stop it? Well, you can't. You can't. That's one of the things about the internet is we no longer have the Walter Cronkite to screen information for us. And you could argue we got too dependent on those gatekeepers. And now we have total democracy, information democracy, in the sense we can scan all this information ourselves and make up our own minds. We don't need a gatekeeper. I don't know if I'm lazy or what, but I'd sort of like to have a gatekeeper to channel some of this stuff for me. So it's, COVID is unfortunately an example of how information can be manipulated. And it's also a lesson on how unprepared much of the public is to deal with this.
Well, in terms of that information overload you were just talking about, and this is kind of more of a psychological question, but in your book, you also write about how access to information, it doesn't necessarily result in sustained interest in a particular issue, and it actually doesn't necessarily produce higher levels of activism. So at what point, after hearing all these stories, seeing awful images, in the news, do we just become numb to it all?
Well, I think that's a really severe issue, because how many cases of humanitarian emergencies can you look at before you burn out, you get compassion fatigue and burn out? I mean, it's similar to the case of the planes on 9/11 going into the World Trade Center. You see that the first time, you're horrified. You see it the second through 10th times, you're horrified. At some point, it becomes just television. And that's the same sort of thing that happens with all this information. It becomes a cacophony, and it's hard to make sense of who's saying what. And I think there are a fair number of people who just tune out. And that's not good for a democracy either. So what we're going to be seeing evolve, I hope, within the next decade, particularly as a new generation of information users matures and perhaps knows more about media literacy, is everybody being his or her own gatekeeper and making more decisions about what information to pay attention to and what information to ignore.
We have a couple more minutes in this portion, and before I open up the floor to additional questions, I want to make sure we talk about China. In your book, you write that you're convinced that above all others, China will be the force exerting influence on the nature of information at war in the future. Can you explain what you call China's three warfares and why they hold the future of information in their hands?
Well, China in many ways puts Russia to shame in terms of the sophistication of the Chinese approach to using information. And the three warfares process involves information, psychological warfare, and legal warfare. They combine those to get information out that they consider favorable to whatever their purpose is. They also, for example, in some of the legal maneuvering around islands in the Pacific that China has laid claim to, they get those tied up in various court practices. But the thing I find most interesting about China's media strategy is how multifaceted it is. You have, for example, the China Global Television Network, which broadcasts in 6 languages. It also has a radio network. You also have Chinese government entities buying advertising, and even buying media properties worldwide. There is a lot of diasporic Chinese language media, and in countries like the United States and Australia and elsewhere. And Chinese entities tied to the Chinese government have been buying up some of those media organizations. And of course, China has its own internet infrastructure, on social media infrastructure. WeChat, which is one of probably their biggest social media forum, has 1 billion users, 100 million of whom are outside China. So it's, China does everything big, and they're not maybe as flashy as the Russians have been, but they understand the value of information, and by the fact that they deliver their product, they buy editorial supplements that appear in American newspapers, they have this broadcasting that goes on, they buy, for example, in Australia, there was a Chinese Australian-owned newspaper that was often critical of Beijing. Now it's owned by an organization representing the Chinese government. The Russians do some of this as well. There's actually in Los Angeles a sort of news organization that calls itself a news organization. And if you follow the chain of ownership, it takes you directly back to the Kremlin. It's owned by the same people who run RT, what used to be called Russia Today, which is without doubt run by the Kremlin. So China is, as in everything else, is very important and very much worth keeping an eye on information matters as well as other matters.
We're now going to open the floor to any questions. There's a couple questions that are kind of similar, so I'm going to merge them. First is, to what degree has the DoD accommodated to this new reality? And then similar to that, is there any indication that the US is employing effective tools to take the disinformation fight to our adversaries?
That's all very complex, and the answer, the summary answer is the United States is not doing enough. The fact that DoD, for example, in Cyber Command was involved in launching that electronic strike in November of 2018, that is really an ad hoc response. There needs to be a better strategy, and that's, it's interesting that today, as I mentioned earlier, these 3 documents come out from the State Department, going to general distribution. I assume they hope that local news media in Ukraine and surrounding and other countries in Europe pick it up. But it's saying taking action to expose and disrupt Russia's destabilization campaign. It seems to me, and I don't mean to be unduly critical of the US response to this, that it's not particularly coherent as yet. There needs to be, probably within the State Department and within the Defense Department and within the intelligence community, an effort that is coordinated to fight this battle. And it is a battle. I'm not sure I want to call it a war yet between the United States and other countries, but you cannot allow any one side in any sort of political conflict to have the upper hand in information. One example, I'll digress a little bit here. One example I cite in the book, and I mentioned briefly before, was in the ongoing conflicts and battles and wars between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. At the outset of these struggles about 10 years ago, Israel had entirely the upper hand in terms of information. They controlled how international news organizations covered the fighting. They controlled access to the battleground and so on and so forth. In the time since then, Hamas has become much more adroit at winning the information battle on a global scale, making their voices heard, using social media effectively. Now, I'm not saying the United States government should model itself on Hamas by any means, but it shows that that case over a period of almost 10 years shows how a country or a political entity can develop its skills in information dissemination, information politics. I think the US has a long way to go in that. We do have the broadcasting, of course, it's been going on for many years on behalf of the US government, but I'd like to see there be a bit more punch. And I think there might be ways even to reach within, if not Russia itself, in some of their more willing allies like Belarus. And I would say it's time to be much more aggressive, and it's up to the policymakers to decide whether that's worthwhile or whether it's too provocative. I would argue it's probably worthwhile.
You write a lot in your previous books about terrorism and terrorists' use of social media. It was one of my favorite topics to write about in your class, I remember. And I'm curious, you have some examples in your book, and I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that and how we see that through ISIS and other groups that are now using online tools, news articles, magazines, propaganda tools, and social media to spread their word.
Yeah, well, of course, Al Qaeda was sort of the breakthrough organization in this. Osama bin Laden, the late and unlamented Osama bin Laden, was very understanding about understood how to reach global publics from his cave in Afghanistan to make his case. Islamic State took that to a whole new level. They had their own news service. They would oftentimes put out news releases claiming that they had perpetrated an attack, and they'd put those out in English before they put them out in Arabic. So we saw a great deal of sophistication. It's going to be interesting to watch in Afghanistan and in some other places whether we are going to see a rebuilding of terrorist infrastructure. I think there's a lot of attention being paid now to Western Africa, which is very important, of course, because Al Qaeda and Islamic State have various outposts there and are causing great suffering to civilian populations there. Whether the Taliban, who know absolutely nothing about running a country, can do some policing of Al Qaeda within Afghanistan is also a big issue, not just related to information, but to not giving these terrorist organizations a chance to rebuild. But I can assure you that based on everything I've seen over the years in writing about terrorism in media, is that all these terrorist outposts will be focusing on trying to win popular support by using media. And wherever there's the internet, there will be a terrorist presence.
There's a struggle that you talk about in your book that I think is also somewhat related, and that tension is between political will and information. And you use an example with President Clinton and how he didn't act on the genocide in Rwanda because he said he hadn't been fully informed about the events taking place. But the United Nations Secretary General said it wasn't a lack of information, it was lack of political will. I think there's probably many arguments about that, over the past few years. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that tension that you outline in your book.
Well, it really puts policymakers in kind of a difficult spot compared to how things were 50 or 100 years ago. And you can't say, as Bill Clinton said in 1998, I believe it was, I didn't know. It's reminiscent of Neville Chamberlain saying in 1938, when the Nazi Germany went into Czechoslovakia, that the Czechs were people of whom we know nothing. there's no place about which we know nothing. There are no people about which we know nothing anymore. There are no events happening about which we know nothing. And so policymakers can't use that as an out any longer. And it just makes their job more difficult. I'm sympathetic to that, but you can be sure that if the Russians go into Ukraine, we're going to see video on on Facebook and various other venues online showing horrific things going on, and the classic call will come, do something. Well, then the US government and the Western European governments have to decide a couple things. What could we do, which is very much an open question, and should we do it? Is it in our national self-interest to go in and try to rescue Ukraine and spend our people's lives, our people's money to do that? The information flow will increase the political pressure to do something. And that's been the case with humanitarian emergencies in the past. Policymakers are going to have to sift through that. I mean, this is a whole different issue than trying to sort of counteract with our own information. But it's going to be one of the big challenges. And again, as long as we have the internet, and that internet is accessible to more than half the people on the planet, there will be political pressures generated by that information. And policymakers will have to decide whether to respond to or ignore that pressure, or something in between.
So I have one more question, Professor Seib, before I turn it over to you for some closing remarks. And this is the big question, which is, with all your research on the nature of information, journalism, modern warfare, do you feel positive about the future of technology and information, or should we be worried?
Worry. I feel positive about the prospective benefits that can come from this new generation of information. But I think the public is, as we've been talking about in terms of media literacy, I think the public globally is largely unprepared to deal with that. And when you talk about technology, then we get into whole different areas that I get into very briefly in the book, about things like autonomous weaponry and artificial intelligence and all that, which tie into information matters in a military context particularly. But as David Sanger mentioned in that quote that I read earlier, the internet was supposed to be a great force for intellectual liberation and the expansion of intellectual depth on the part of the public, because so much information would be available. And just think how many times, we check on Google or Safari because something has caught our attention and we'd like to know a little bit more about that. That is a microcosmic example of how all this has been changing our lives. And I think I'd like to be somewhat optimistic, but very cautiously optimistic about this. And again, my inclination is not to say, well, government should do more to enhance our dealings with information. I think it should be a matter of personal responsibility. Individual citizens need to do this, just as parents need to supervise what their children are doing, if anything, on the internet. They need to supervise themselves too. And so that's why my optimism is coated in caution, but I like to be optimistic, otherwise I'll get too depressed.
It's probably good advice for all of us. All right, Professor Seib, I'll turn it back to you if you have any last closing remarks before we close out the call.
Well, I've enjoyed talking with you, and I hope the people in the who've been joining us have found some things of interest here. I guess the most important thing is to plug the book, Information at War, Journalism, Disinformation, and Modern Warfare. It's available from Barnes & Noble and Amazon and maybe some bookstores. Paperback is $25. I'm fairly pleased with it. I've written a lot of books, and I think this is one of my better ones. I guess my final message is that people should not look at information, particularly related to warfare, as a sideshow. It is too integral to our lives to consider it that way. You might have said back in the 1940s or earlier in the 20th century, well, we can tune out propaganda. It's easy to tune it out. We just won't pay any attention to it. Today, it's hard to tune out things because, for one thing, a lot of the information we get, I mean, it doesn't say made in the Kremlin. I mean, it comes in and looking like legitimate news broadcasts, looking like legitimate political advertising, and so on and so forth. And so I think the public should realize that there is a demand for a greater intellectual effort on their part to deal with the intricacies of ingesting all this information. Part of the problem is it has been so sudden. I mean, you can think back to when there was no internet, to when there was no Zoom. We couldn't be doing this during a pandemic a few years ago. And so we've got all these new technologies, many of which are useful, but we have to adapt to them. It's like the school kids or college students, grad students, who have to adapt to learning outside the classroom. They have to learn remotely. I retired from USC last summer, and during my last year of teaching, after 40 years of university teaching, I had never seen so many students with mental health issues who came to me to talk about them. And that is in part a function of the newness of all this. You know, you go to college, you're in grad school, you've been going to college, you've been in classrooms for 14, 16, 18 years, and all of a sudden it disappears. Well, that is in a way related to the way information is changing our lives and changing how we make judges in a political / military context. So I guess my parting words are, learn about this stuff, certainly, and also realize that it's going to require some effort. You can't just sort of say, well, I'll look online. I'll look and see what Google says about information warfare. Who knows where that's coming from? And so I wish everyone good luck at venturing into this. And I hope that people will not forget how important it is.
Thank you, Professor Seib. The book is excellent. I advise everybody to read it with a highlighter because you'll not want to put it down and you'll want to remember everything. If folks want to connect with you or keep in touch and follow what you're up to, are you on social media? How can they connect with you?
Well, I'm on Twitter. I think I'm just at Philip Seib. And also, if you have questions, feel free to email me. My email address is just my last name, Seib, SEIB, at usc.edu. And I'll be happy to be in touch with you and if you have questions, to try to answer them. And Madison, thank you. Maybe I'll raise your grade to an A++. Thank you for moderating so well today. And thanks to the Pacific Council, to my old buddy Jerry Green, and to others at the Pacific Council for providing this forum.
Thank you all so much. Thanks for participating. Thank you, Professor Seib. Also, thanks to the Pacific Council. It's nice to be back. Stay safe, everybody, and hope you have a great weekend.
Okay, thanks.